Hey, how's it going everyone? Steve Monkey here, back with another build guide. And this one's for Classic Chef Blair, who has just been amazing thanks to his insanely massive AoE damage, allowing him to control basically the entire battlefield. And not only does he have this insane AoE, he also has incredibly low cooldowns, and thanks to his second ability, he's also fairly self-sufficient, with him being able to heal not only his HP, but also recover his MP as well. Now, if you guys don't know what Classic Chef does, let me go ahead and throw up on the screen there. Go ahead and pause and read if you need to. I've been loving this Blair rework. He's been a lot of fun. They did a really good job with him. And I've just been enjoying myself so much. But that's enough me yapping. I'm gonna go ahead and get you guys into this build guide so you can get out there with Blair as well. And as always, let's go ahead and start with our mod section, where we'll go ahead and break down every mod and how they fit into the overall build. And we'll be beginning our mods with our cooldown mod section. Or the first one here being Nimble Fingers. The reason we're running Nimble Fingers is there's no downside to this module, and it gives us a nice chunk of cooldown, so it's just a free one to run. And we have Shield Consumption as our next one. Now this gives us a really large chunk of skill cooldown, with the only downside being it minuses our max shields, but we really don't care about that, because most of Blair's survivability is in his HP, because not only does he scale better with HP, but also his second ability heals him based off his max HP and every flame wall on the ground. So because we already have a much better way to heal our survivability stat, aka our HP, through our second ability, shields just don't matter at all. In fact, through a couple places in this build, we'll just be removing max shield, because once again, they just don't matter compared to HP. Now, why are we actually running so much cooldown? Well, this build is really spam heavy. That's how we're going to get most of our damage. You really want to be able to spam all of your abilities to get the largest amount of AoEs possible, especially since you need to be able to throw out as many flame walls as possible to maximize Blair's passive, which you need quite a sizable chunk. I believe to get his max passive, you need 9, which we'll go over that in a second. But this also allows you to spam out your third ability, which is a large chunk of your damage, and your second ability, since your second ability can refresh the cooldown on your fourth ability, which is also a big damage ability. Since your second ability, for every flame wall on the ground, when you use your second ability, you reduce your fourth ability's cooldown by, I believe, 10% of the remaining cooldown. But I believe this only works up till 6 flame walls, so you can only reduce your fourth ability's remaining cooldown by up to 60%. But that still allows you to spam out your fourth ability a lot more. And this is pretty much the reason why we want to run cooldown, is to really maximize our damage through being able to spam out our abilities a whole lot more than we normally could. And another reason we want to run so much cooldown is to really maximize our passive, which revolves around crit rate. But before we go into how that works, let's go over our crit modules, with our first one being skill concentration. Now we want to run this one because this gives us a sizable damage increase through increasing our skill crit damage. And it has no downside, so it's just a free one to run. And next we have front lines. Now running this one because this gives us another decent sized chunk of skill crit damage increase and a small amount of skill critical hit rate. Now this may seem odd that we're only actually running 2 crit modules compared to most builds which run something like 3 or 4, but that revolves around the passive we were just talking about. So Classic Chef Blair has a really cool effect as passive that he gains increased skill critical hit rate from his flame wells, which most of Blair's builds do, but the unique thing here is it goes up to 9 flame wells, each giving you 6% skill critical hit rate additive. And Blair has a base skill critical hit rate of 20%, which means you get 54 from your passive added onto your base of 20%, meaning you have 74% base skill critical hit rate, which is a lot, meaning we really don't need that much skill critical hit rate to actually hit 100% here. In fact, we only need front lines and a little bit from our Arche Tree, which we'll talk about later. And this is why we really want the cooldown, is to be able to keep at that 100% skill critical hit rate thanks to having a whole bunch of flame walls on the ground, which will help maximize our damage because it'll make us be able to get that 100% skill critical hit rate, which will make us have consistent crits. And this is another way we're also maximizing our damage. And of course, we're also going to increase our damage through increasing our skill power. And the module we're going to run here is Power Increase, which just increases our base skill power. Now, since we're running Domino Drive, and we also get some from our Reactor, it turns out Power Increase is better than fire specialists, especially when we start to include, your ancestor modules, which can also roll fire skill power boost. But because you'll actually have two different options between trigger modules, it does kind of flip in which one's more efficient. So we'll talk about your options for trigger modules later. But if you run Domino Drive, power increase becomes more efficient. But if you don't roll any fire power on your ancestor module, and you also run a different trigger module, then fire specialist will technically become better. Because you'll already be getting 30% skill power base from your second ability, which gives you stacking skill power. So it's just kind of an interesting thing that, depending on how you kind of change the build, power increase and fire specialist kind of flip between which one's better. For this version though, power increase is going to be better, and especially once again if you do get any fire skill power boost on your ancestor module, then of course power increase will become much better, because then you'll already be getting plenty of fire skill power boost from that ancestor module. And thanks to how the damage formula for Descendant works, you really want to balance those pools out. So it just becomes like a weird balancing act, basically. And then we're also getting more fire skill power boost ratio from Fire Syncytium. Even though this is just a small little amount, every bit will help increase our damage. Plus, this fire skill power boost ratio will help with one of our mutant cells to reduce fire resistance, which will also allow us to do more damage, especially in things like Onslaught 4 and other endgame modes where the resistance tends to get fairly high for a lot of enemies. So this next module slot gets a little weird. Now, as we just talked about, there's actually two trigger modules you can run here, and that would be Domino Drive or Infect a Weapon, and we'll go over the differences between these two in the trigger module section later in the build. But the key thing about this module slot is it changes depending on what trigger module you run. So if you run Domino Drive, you want Chain Reaction, because this gives you a 20% increase to any skill damage. So all of your abilities will get a 20% increase, as long as you have Domino Drive active. Versus if you run Infected Weapons, you want Infection Amplifier, because if you have the Infection passive on any enemy, they have a 30% chance to take an additional proc of damage from any skill hit, and that additional proc of damage is worth 250% of your skill power, which is just another nice chunk of damage. Now, once again, we'll go over the differences between Domino Drive versus Infected Weapon in the trigger module section, and we'll also talk a little bit about the modules that can go in this slot here. And now let's go over our skill effect range mod here. We're going to run skill expansion, and this has a couple of reasons we're running it. So the first reason is, compared to the one that's just slightly more skill effect range, this one doesn't have the downside of lowering your skill modifiers. And don't forget, your first ability has fairly low modifiers as it already is, so lowering it any at all will kind of greatly reduce its damage. So we don't want to do that, so we're going to run skill expansion because it has no downside. The second reason we want to run this is because using skill expansion along with either Domino Drive or your Inversion Reinforcement, you can hit the max spawn rate of Flame Wells for your first ability, because that one is based off your skill effect range. And this will allow us to hit that max spawn rate, which we really want to hit, because don't forget we need Flame Wells for pretty much all of our abilities, especially for our skill crit rate. Now, how these spawn is a little weird, so I'll show that in the tips and tricks section later in the video. But basically, this will just allow us to hit that max rate. The other big reason is because all of our damage abilities do get increased with skill effect range and size, allowing us to do more AoE and hit more enemies with each of our abilities, which will help maximize our damage a lot. And of course, we need some survivability, so for that we're going to run HP amplification, which gives us a nice chunk of HP, with the only downside of removing our max shield. And as we talked about earlier, we really don't care about max shield, instead we care only really about max HP, since our second ability will heal us based off our max HP and our flame wall count. That's why HP is such an important stat here. And as always, we'll go ahead and move our Ancestor mod to its own section, where we'll go ahead and go over every stat, break them down, and put them in the tier chart that you guys can use as a reference if your Ancestor module is good, or if you want to go ahead and re-roll it. Now, if you want to jump to that right now, there is a link in the description of the video, and a timestamp, and the timeline of the video itself. And now let's finally go over those trigger modules I kept talking about. So as I said, there are 2 trigger modules you can use here, Domino Drive or Infected Weapons. So both these modules are pretty much going to be the same damage-wise. I've tested both thoroughly, and including an Onslaught level 4, and pretty much every time I ended with either of these ones, they were roughly about the same damage. So you're not really going to see any big damage difference. This is mainly going to come down to a playstyle difference of which one you want to run. And to kind of sum it up, if you want infected weapons, you're going for more of a dot playstyle where you just want to inflict a whole bunch of dots on enemies. And then Domino Drive is going to be more of a burst style gameplay where you just want large damage increases for each of your high damage abilities. Well, let's go into more of the details of this. So infected weapons is really good because of its dot damage, because you inflict infected weapons passive, which is another something like 800 skill modifier scaling on top of any of your burn damage, which is really good. And on top of that, you also get infection amplifier, which, as we talked about before, this makes it so that whenever they're infected by infected weapons passive, they have a chance to take an additional 250% damage based off your skill power. So it's your skill power times 250%, which is another sizable chunk of damage. This becomes really good, especially when enemies are more spread out, and they're only taking like maybe 1 or 2 ticks from your flame wells or your abilities, because then they get the infected weapon passive, where they're also going to take another tick of dot damage. But the unfortunate thing is they can only take 1 instance of this dot damage, so you can't stack like multiple instances. It will tick over about 8 seconds, where they take instance of damage every 1 second, I believe. But once again, the unfortunate thing is you can't like have 5 procs of this going at once. You only get 1 instance. And that's kind of where the difference of Domino Drive comes in. So while infected weapons is really good for dot damage when enemies are spread out and they're only taking, once again, 1 instance of dot damage from your flame walls or something along those lines, Domino Drive is better at burst damage because this one gives you stacking fire skill power and stacking skill effect range, which Blair really wants both those. Though in all honesty, you only probably on average have 3 to 4 of the stacks out of the 7 max you can usually get. So you rarely ever hit max stacks. You're not really going to get full efficiency out of this because of how you spam your abilities. Since your second and third abilities proc Domino Drive, and you can only really use your first and fourth abilities to stack it. So, and usually you're going to get about like 1 to 2 instances of your first ability and 1 instance of your fourth ability out before you proc your second and third abilities. So once again, you're not really going to ever have Domino Drive fully stacked, but that is a decent damage increase. The other thing is you get Chain Reaction, which is a 20% damage increase for your skill damage across the board. And this is kind of where the main difference comes in. So for something like your Flame Wells and pretty much all of your abilities, it turns out an enemy, if they're standing in 2 Flame Wells, take damage from both Flame Wells. And this also works with your third ability, since your third ability procs where your Flame Well is, an enemy will take 2 instances of damage from each, well, 2 instances of damage, since you'll take 1 from each one. Which is a large chunk of damage, and you'll get 20% increase for each of those. So this is what I mean by it's more of like burst damage, the Chain Reaction and Domino Drive are really good for, because you'll get 20% for that, compared to even if you hit an enemy with 5 abilities at once, Infected Weapon is only going to give them 1 instance of Infected Weapon. But once again, Infected Weapon is really good if they only take that 1 tick of dot damage, versus, once again, Chain Reaction and Domino Drive is really good if you're getting stacks of Flame Wells underneath them and proccing multiple third abilities. So this is what I mean by it comes down to a playstyle difference. On average, they're going to be about the same damage, but do you want more dot damage, or do you want more burst damage? It's really just a playstyle difference. Neither one is better than the other. And now let's finally dive into our Ancestor Mod section, where we'll go over every stat you can roll on an Ancestor module, break them down, put them into a tier chart. You guys can just reference if your Ancestor modules are good, or if you want to go ahead and re-roll them. And starting with S tier, which is going to be our best tier, We have singular skill power boost ratio. Now this one's a really good stat to roll, because it turns out there isn't that many ways to roll type skill power. In fact, your Ancestor module is usually the best way to roll them, and since Blair is a singular type Descendant, this is a really good way to increase your damage. Then we have skill critical hit damage. Once again, Blair is a crit character, and not only is he a crit character, but his passive gives him additive 20% additional crit damage. Meaning skill crit hit damage is just really efficient on him to increase his damage. And then we have fire skill power boost ratio. Once again, Blair is a fire descendant. And it's just really good because, unfortunately for fire descendants, there isn't too many ways they can usually get fire skill power compared to the other attributes. And your Ancestor module is usually one of the best places if you don't want to run it as much in the mod section. So it's just a really good stat. It also will work with one of our Mutant Cells later to help reduce fire resistance. So it's also a good reason to run it because of that. And then going on to A tier, which is still a really good tier, we have max HP. As we talked about in the mod section, HP is just really efficient on Blair thanks to his second ability. This is a really good survivability stat to roll. And then we have singular skill modifier, which may seem a little odd to be in here, but this will ramp up things like your flame wall, which have pretty low scaling. So this is just another good way to ramp up your AoE damage. And then going on to B tier, which is our middle pact values, we have skill duration up. So this is mainly to increase the duration of your flame wells and your burn. It's not actually that really efficient of a value, that's why it's in B tier. And to be honest, most of your flame wells will be cycled through because you'll be consuming them with your second ability, and then just throwing out new flame wells with your first and fourth abilities. So it's not that great of a stat, but it's okay because mainly it will cause your burn damage to have a longer duration, which means you'll do more tick damage over a longer period of time. Then we have skill effect range. We don't really much more skill effect range. Technically, a lot of our abilities can get slightly larger radiuses, but it's not enough to really warrant this being that good of a value, but it is an okay value. Mainly if you were to get this, you'd probably replace the module in our mod section with something else like more damage or survivability. But this just isn't that great because we already hit the skill effect range we need to be our max spawn rate of our flame wells, which is the main reason we need skill effect range. Then we have max MP. This is an okay stat to roll, because with Blair's second ability, not only does it heal HP, he also heals MP, and that one is based off his max MP. This will just cause you to regen more MP when you use that second ability. But Blair already pretty much keeps up with all of his skill costs already, so it's just an okay value to roll. And we have defense. Defense is just always an okay defensive value to roll. It's a more survivability, which is never bad. And then moving on to C tier. Now C tier, these are values you just want to avoid because they don't really help the build at all if you roll them as positive, and if you roll them as a negative, it would hurt the build. Starting off with skill cooldown. Now, the main reason this one is here is because we already hit max cooldown rate, and you just don't really have anything you'd really replace the mods with in your mod section, outside of maybe some more survivability. And technically you could change out your Reactor to have a skill power boost ratio on it, or maybe get a little bit more damage in your Arche Tree. But this just wouldn't be anywhere near as good as rolling something in S tier. So that's why this is in C tier, because we already hit max cooldown with being fairly min-maxed around it. And then you can't roll this as a negative because you'll just lower your cooldown rates, which is something we want to avoid since Blair really likes to spam with those abilities. Then we have skill critical hit rate. Now this one's here because this one would be massive overkill. So Blair already has, as we talked about before, a base of 74% skill critical hit rate. So it doesn't really take that much to get that to max. In fact, I believe it only takes around 35% additional skill critical hit rate to get that up to 100%. And we already hit that in our build relatively easily. In fact, the only place you could really move it would be the Arche Tree, since that doesn't really have a use outside, getting us to 100%. But you really want to remove it from the mod section because we're running frontlines, and frontlines gives us a decent amount of damage on top of giving us a skill critical hit rate. So really, it's just too overkill for this stat. Even at your bare minimum value, it would just be too much. You'd rather just roll something in A or S tier here. So you just want to avoid this one. And then D tier. Now these stats are perfectly taken as a negative because they don't really hurt the build if you take them as a negative. And if you're taking them as positive, they do next to nothing. Our first stat here is skill cost. Now, as we talked about, Blair already heals his MP, so you really don't have to worry about cost increase because you can more than easily keep up with any cost that you have. Then we have Dimension Skill Power Boost Ratio and Dimension Skill Modifier. Blair has 0 dimension scalings in this build, so they would do nothing for the build, so they're perfect to take as a negative. And then Max Shield. We already pretty much reduced our Max Shield to nothing, so reducing it more isn't going to hurt the build. And once again, survivability is just so much better with HP for Blair because of his second ability and his high base HP stats. And that's going to be it for the tier chart here. Hopefully this will help you guys with your Ancestor modules while you're determining if you want to keep them or if you want to go ahead and re-roll them. And then we finish all of our mod sections, let's go and dive into our Arche Tree, which is a little bit weird this time because we're going to be doing a 2 Mutant Cell setup here. But first, let's go ahead and go over all the nodes that we're hitting before we dive into those Mutant Cells. So the first ones I want to point out is we're going to grab the skill crit damage nodes and most of the skill crit nodes. This will help us hit 100% skill critical hit rate and increase our damage a lot since Blair is a crit Descendant. Then we also want to grab that gold cooldown node. It's just, once again, we want to spam our abilities as much as possible, and this will help us get to 75% cooldown rate, which is the max cooldown rate. And now for the Mutant Cells. Now this is a little bit weird because we are grabbing some odd nodes to hit these, but it turns out grabbing these 2 Mutant Cells actually maximizes our damage, especially in endgame, because of how much resistance it shreds. So in the top right, the one we're going to grab is Fire Chain Catalyst, which will reduce enemies' fire resistance based off your fire skill power. Which is why we try and add a whole bunch of fire skill power into this build, is to maximize this value. But the lower fire skill power you have, the less efficient this is. But with how much, once again, with how much we run, it turns out to be pretty efficient. Then, next Mutant Cell we're going to run is Defense Neutralization over there in the left top of the Arche Tree. This one is anytime you hit an enemy at max HP, you reduce not only their fire resistance, but every element besides non-attribute, and their defense, which not only helps you do more damage, but also allows your allies to do more damage as well. And this is a lot easier to hit for Blair because he's doing mass AoE, he's spreading his fire a lot. And not only that, but there's several enemies and things like Onslaught now that give shields to allies. So often enough you're able to proc this a little bit easier without someone else on your team accidentally doing a little bit of chip damage and making it so you can't proc this. So overall defense neutralization is a lot easier to use now. And between these two, you shred a lot of resistance. I believe if you were to hit max values of both these, it'd be 50% resistance reduction on that enemy. So this helps increase your damage a lot, because once again, in a lot of these endgame modes, enemies have incredibly high resistance values. And now let's go over the components that we'll be running for this build, which will be Firebrand set. Now we're running this one because it's really good with Blair, since Blair burns enemies with every single one of his abilities, besides, his second one, which doesn't do any damage. And this one makes it so anytime you burn an enemy with an ability, you reduce their fire resistance, which, as we talked about in the Arche Tree with our Mutant Cells, is really efficient in endgame. And since all these stack, we're reducing the resistance by a lot, allowing us to really maximize that damage, and kind of ignore a lot of the resistance values in things like Onslaught and other endgame modes. And this will also be useful for any of the future endgame modes coming out as well. Now, for the subsets you're going to run here, you're going to want to run max HP, max MP, defense, and MP recovery modifier. This will help with survivability, and with keeping your MP topped off. And then going on to your component cores, what you're going to want to run is 4 max HP, since once again, as we talked about before, HP is really efficient on Blair. And then 4 defense. This is just really good for survivability, since it gives you damage reduction taken from a lot of sources. And for the Inversion Reinforcement nodes we'll be running for this build will be Spatial Dominance, which, as we talked about in the mod section, will help us be able to reach that max Flame Mull spawn rate. Then we want Deploy Hardened Shell. This will make it so every time we take damage, we get damage taken reduction. That stacks. This is really good for survivability. And there's the same logic for combat adaptation. Every time you defeat an enemy, you also get incoming damage reduction. So you take less damage at a percentage value, which the enemies in a lot of the endgame modes hit really hard. So taking a percentile less damage is a really good survivability stat. And for this build, we'll be running a Fire Singular Reactor. This is because Blair's a Fire Descendant, and Classic Chef turns all Blair skills into type of Singular. And then for our substats, we'll be wanting skill cooldown. Once again, this will help us get that max cooldown rate. And then skill critical hit damage. This is just to amplify our damage, since Blair is once again a crit Descendant. And now for the weapon we'll run for this build, will be Truly Deadly Arson. Which we're running this one because of its unique ability, which is every time you use a fire type skill, you gain a stack, and then once you use a continuous type skill, it converts it into continuous type skill power. Which Blair has fire type skills, and your first and your fourth abilities are continuous type, meaning you can proc this and amp up the damage of those two abilities. Now, because we really only care about that unique passive, the build for this becomes pretty bare bones. All you need for weapon cores is 2 grappling hook time increase ratios. And then for your mods, all you need is Heat Incinerator and Brisk Walk. Heat Incinerator helps spread burn, and Brisk Walk just for some additional movement speed. And finally, it's time for the tips and tricks section, in which I'll show you guys a few things helping you along while you're playing Blair. So the first thing I kind of wanted to show / explain was the flame wall system. So the amount of flame walls you can spawn increases with your range, as we talked about in the mod section. But you need enemies to actually be able to spawn the flame walls. So if there's no enemies, you actually only spawn 1 flame wall, like so. And if we spawn an enemy, we'll end up spawning 2. So we'll let this one despawn real quick. So it turns out, based off your range, it increases the number you can spawn based off how many enemies are around you. So we can spawn up to a max of 4. So even if we have 5 enemies, only 4 will spawn. There we go. And this works pretty much no matter what. So if there's only 2 enemies, you only get 3. So you really, to get your max spawn rate, you need a group of enemies and a skill effect range. So the next thing I want to show you guys was, I talked about how multiple flame walls on the ground can damage an enemy multiple times, so they can stack, like so. You can see it's increasing in tick rate. It's because each flame wall is damaging him. But on top of that, also your third ability, if there's multiple flame walls going, they'll actually each stack to do damage as well. So here I'll just show you guys with a singular stack. Let's get our max crit rate. So about 31 million DPS. Go ahead and reset everything here. So now if we do that again, spawn 2, you can see one up to 62 million. This keeps working, so you can just keep doing it. And as you guys can see, it went up again. This is really good if you're trying to kill hyper healthy elites or bosses, especially against something like a Colossi. You can stack a whole bunch of flame walls underneath the Colossi and choose your third ability, and it'll do a lot of damage, because once again, you're getting several third abilities to stack. This also once again works if you have multiple targets that are there. They each get flame walls spawned underneath them, and you just use the third ability. And because they stacked a whole bunch of flame walls on top of themselves, they're going to take a lot of damage. It's just like a cool little thing with your third ability to really min-max its damage. So there's one other thing though I wanted to show you guys beyond how the flame walls works and how to increase the damage of your third ability. And that has to deal with your fourth ability. Now, we talked about how, based on the number of flame walls on the ground, using your second ability, you can get your cooldown back. So I just want to show you guys that real quick. So we're throwing our flame well there. And we're just going to immediately absorb these. As you guys can see, it just immediately jumped back up. You really want to add this to your rotation of your skills, so you can constantly throw back your fours. Back to back to back. You can see there, it keeps going back up, and then it allows me to cast my fourth a lot quicker. And it's based off the number of flame walls you have. So if you only have something like 2. Let me see if I can get a little bit out of range here. See, it's based off the number of flame walls, so... Once again, this is just a quick way to increase your damage since you'll be able to cast your 4th a lot faster. And it's just something you really want to add to your rotation. Hopefully a couple of these things help you guys along while you're playing Blair. And that's going to go wrap up for this Blair build guide. Now, I think the Blair rework has been a lot of fun, especially with Classic Chef, where we're just lighting the entire battlefield on fire thanks to his massive AoE. I think they really nailed it with his Blair rework. I think a lot of his modules have actually been really fun. Like I said, especially Classic Chef. Well, let me know what you guys think about the build down in the comments down below. Or if you have any questions, also give me it down below as well in the comments as well. And if you guys did enjoy the video or plan to use the build, I appreciate you if you hit that like button. And if you want to know when new videos are coming out, don't forget that subscribe button and that notification bell. I plan to do a lot of Blair builds this coming month. You guys saw in the mod section, each of those different tabs are actually different builds I'm currently working on for him that I plan to release videos for. I'm actually pretty excited to work on those because Blair is just a lot of fun right now. But I also do stream on Twitch. Let me go and throw up the information on the screen there. And once again, if you guys could hit that like button, I really would appreciate it. It helps the video get to a lot more people. And that's going to go and wrap it up for this build video. Appreciate y'all watching, and I'll catch y'all again later.